There's been a lot of talk recently about glyphosate, and in particular, whether or not that it causes cancer. Recently, Bayer paid out a $7.25 billion settlement because people were alleging that their product, Roundup, causes cancer. Some studies and some researchers believe that this is true, but unfortunately, federal regulators think that it's not true, and that's why it's still on the market. So, what's going on here? What's the actual truth? I've actually been getting a lot of questions about this from some of my patients because it's been in the news so much so that even President Trump has recently spoken about it. So, what is glyphosate? Glyphosate is the main ingredient in weed killers, particularly Roundup, and it's the number one used herbicide in all of US agriculture. So, why do people think that it causes cancer? That's because in 2015, the World Health Organization labeled it as likely carcinogenic to humans. This was based on three main reasons. The first was a study that showed high exposure rates were linked to elevated incidence of non Hodgkin's lymphoma. This was particularly true in farmers and other agricultural workers who had significant exposure to the chemical. The second was that animal studies showed increased tumor growth with exposure to glyphosate. And lastly, studies show that direct exposure of our cells and DNA to glyphosate causes reactive oxygen species and direct cellular and DNA damage. This is the precursor to cancers as we know it. So theoretically, it's reasonable to believe that it really does cause cancer in humans. Unfortunately, these studies really only looked at high exposure rates and not necessarily exposure rates of everyday Americans. When we look at the actual studies, it gets a little more confusing. The largest human study, the agricultural health study, followed tens of thousands of pesticide applicators. So these people have high exposure rates to the chemicals, and it did show an increased incidence in non Hodgkin's lymphoma. There was also another study, a 2019 meta analysis, which also showed increased incidence of non Hodgkin's lymphoma with high exposure rates to glyphosate. However, upon follow up of that same study, there was no association between increased cancer rates or increased levels of non Hodgkin's lymphoma with glyphosate exposure. So, overall, the data with human studies is quite mixed. I would say that it does seem to be a correlation with high exposure rates to glyphosate with increased incidence of non Hodgkin's lymphoma. This is why regulatory bodies such as the US EPA and other European agencies label it as likely not carcinogenic. That's because there's not enough population level studies that show an association between glyphosate and increased cancer rates, especially at the exposure levels that we see on a daily basis. So the debate really comes down to how risk is defined. The World Health Organization and the EPA are answering two separate questions. The World Health Organization is saying, can glyphosate cause cancer, period, at any exposure levels? But the EPA is saying, can glyphosate at the exposure levels that we see on a daily basis cause cancer? So they can both be right but disagree at the same time. For instance, high exposure rates are linked to increased levels of non Hodgkin's lymphoma, but there's no correlation between the current exposure rates that US citizens see on an everyday basis and increased incidence of cancer. There is one important update. In 2025, a highly cited paper that claimed that glyphosate was safe was retracted due to ethical reasons. The journal found that there was non disclosed involvement by the parent company, as well as a conflict of interest. While this doesn't prove that glyphosate is unsafe, it does show how industry involvement has complicated the scientific debate. Laboratory studies do show that glyphosate causes an increase in reactive oxygen species, and reactive oxygen species are known to cause DNA damage, and replication of this DNA damage is the direct precursor to cancers. But many of the effects of these studies were shown at high doses and much higher than the typical human exposure rate, or with compounded herbicides and not necessarily just glyphosate alone. So, again, it really boils down to how much exposure that the patient has, and not necessarily does it or does it not cause cancer. So, what does this mean for our health overall? There is likely a correlation or association between high and long term exposure rates with glyphosate and increased levels of cancers, and specifically non Hodgkin's lymphoma. This is seen in agricultural workers or pesticide sprayers, but there's no good studies or good scientific data that link or show an association of increased cancer rates or increased incidence of non Hodgkin lymphoma with your typical exposure or your typical dietary intake. So, overall, I don't think glyphosate is completely safe, but unfortunately, there's not good data that shows that at the current exposure rates that it's causing increased cancer rates. I do think that more studies are needed, especially ethical studies, at the exposure rates that we see on a daily basis.